Hey, U.S. History students. Hope you are doing well. And it's good to be back with you again. We are going to focus our attention today on one really big area of activism in the 1960s and beyond. And this is not a new topic to us. We've talked about things related to feminism in the 1840s with Seneca Falls. We've kind of moved into that a little bit in the later 1890s with the rise of important leaders like Jane Addams, the 1920s flappers. And of course, now we're at a period of time that kind of is an extension of the civil rights era that we looked at this not long ago. And I want you all to think just really quickly about when you hear the term feminism, what are some general ideas that tend to get maybe thrown around? Okay. And so why do I bring that up? And the reason being, guys, is because there's and I'm sure different sources will cite this differently, but I think at the end of the day, when you're looking at a good basic nuts and bolts definition of feminism, we're looking at the idea of a movement to achieve equality in economic ways, political ways, social ways, and also legal ways between men and women. So the question is, okay, that comes across to a lot of people as a fairly straightforward goal or movement. Why is there going to be division within women about the issue, and of course men as well? Okay, so like any movement, guys, kind of keep in mind what we've said is that you're usually going to have leadership, you're going to have goals, you're going to have strategies, you're usually going to have a degree of opposition or maybe some resistance, and then also you're usually going to have, how do we tell that that movement was somewhat effective? In other words, outcomes. Okay, so in the case of feminism, this is kind of a broad overview, but you're going to have a lot of big similarities to even the civil rights movement. Like, for example, organizations, the now National Organization of Women, as it was known as, is going to be one of those really important rising organizations that really makes it a goal to move the cause of women's rights further. And you're going to have leaders, like, for example, you're going to have people like Betty Friedan, who wrote the famous Feminine Mystique in the earlier 1960s. And Friedan was seen as kind of like, I don't know if I would put her in the exact category as what the earlier 1900s would call a muckraker, but she certainly does something similar in that she writes, she exposes problems and things that she thinks are an issue. Her argument, guys, for the most part, in a nutshell, you could say, is that there's something about women that they desire something that goes beyond just simply what maybe domestic housewife roles would produce. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, you're going to have certain people, men and women as well, that are going to feel like, well, there's some fulfillment with simply, I shouldn't say simply there, but raising children and so forth. And so therefore, as you can imagine, there's going to be some clashes. All right, we'll talk about that more in a second. And then you're also going to have one of the other more important leaders, and a lady by the name of Gloria Steinem. And Steinem's picture, by the way, is at the bottom here. And the picture right there is Betty Friedan. Okay, so we're going to read a short excerpt of the now statement. What kinds of things did they see as necessary? And then the question is, okay, what goals do they have? Well, you've got a gender gap as far as wages. You've got social things, the idea of even education, which is linked obviously across a lot of different circles, political things. But you've got a lot of things, guys, in that area that a lot of women are like, hey, we are not basically where we need to be. Okay. So, think about it like this. Why was it prior to this time period that you don't see as many women in, let's say, professions like medicine and engineering and law? And I would say it's not because they don't have the skill to do it, but it's the opportunity of availability. Okay. So again, you're looking at some of those issues of gender equality that need to not just be exposed, but certainly addressed. Now, what's going to happen that brings about some, shall we say, big things that kind of define the movement? Well, you're going to have, this is not on the slide, but you're going to have an Equal Pay Act that was passed in the earlier 1960s by Congress. Um, I would argue that there is a little bit of progress with that, but certainly not as much as some people would envision. I remember one of the few times that I ever saw my mother angry, other than things that I did was somewhat boneheaded at times, was having a conversation with her after we started to learn about this in the earlier 90s when I was in high school. And I remember asking my mom, Mom, does this gender wage gap still exist? And of course she was like, yeah. And the job that she was in was one where she made the argument. She said, with her credentials and so forth, if a male had been basically working the same job with the same amount of credentials, he's probably going to be making a 5 to 10,000 more a year salary, just because of the difference in gender. Okay. And that's as we know, as the 1990s. Now, that's not to downplay the fact, guys, that these issues still exist, and therefore we still have people that argue in favor of feminism in certain ways. But again, you are going to have a certain, I would argue, factions within the feminism movement that obviously have certain differences on maybe approaches. And it's maybe not that dramatically different than even differences between like King and Malcolm X and the civil rights movement, amongst others. Okay, so what do a lot of these women's rights advocates basically support? Well, one of the big things that gets a lot of attention is the idea of right to privacy, as well as the idea of what we call right to choose. That's where the famous Roe v. Wade case of 1973 comes into it. A lot of you have heard of this. The idea that the Supreme Court formally observed that at least in the first 3 months or first trimester, that abortion was seen as legalized. Now, you could look at that as a major breakthrough for defining women's reproduction rights or whatever. But at the end of the day, we know that it's going to spark some controversy on different sides. Okay, there's going to be a push for an equal rights amendment. Now, stop right there and say, okay, well, where is this amendment in our Constitution? The answer is it's not there. And look at what it says. I mean, guys, it's not really something that is complex. It says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Okay. And so a lot of people look at that, and that's pretty much what the proposed amendment was advocating for. A lot of people are like, okay, well, why is that something that not all women are going to agree with? So as you can imagine, you're going to have certain people, in this case, women. Phyllis Schlafly, I'll get to her more in a moment, who's going to really take it upon her. It's almost like a mission, you could say, to actually go about almost on a bandwagon to successfully defeat the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, well, how close was this amendment to being passed? It got 36 of the necessary 38 states. Okay, but it was two states short. And there's an argument to be made is that there's a degree of division between more liberal thinking and then also the rise of more conservative thinking. A lot of historians, guys, view this clash, if you will, as almost an example of a culture war. We saw that in the 1920s with more conservative ideas kind of opposing things like the flapper movement and things like that. And there is a common, I think, connection there. Okay, so Phyllis Schlafly is an interesting figure because a lot of people are like, well, was she advocating for the lack of education or no? I want to say she was educated. She had it was a law degree, but she did believe firmly in the idea of course, protecting a degree of tradition. Now, I'm not going to tell you whether you should agree or disagree with either side. That we'll get to as we discuss this document in our whole class session. But if you take a look at what Phyllis Schlafly says, look at what she says when she was trying to defend her record or her position. It won't have, talking about the ERA. ERA is the abbreviation for Equal Rights Amendment, guys. It won't do anything to help women, and it will take away from women the rights that they already have, such as the right of a wife to be supported by her husband, the right of a woman to be exempted from military combat, and the right to go to single-sex college. Okay, so I want you all to think, all right, use your noggin, as my mom used to say quite a bit when I was younger. I want you to think about, why would this person have this position? Okay, and more importantly beyond that, was her campaign effective? Now, just a side note, those of you that like pop culture and streaming, they're actually Hulu. I don't have Hulu myself, but a lot of you do. They're actually producing and actually it starts April 15th. So it's pretty close to now, a series called Mrs. American, excuse me. And what it does, guys, I've not watched it, but it's coming out, as I said, but I've done a little bit of research on it. But evidently they're showcasing basically Schlafly's role with defeating the ERA. There's some emphasis on Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, etc. Okay. And so her movement, if you will, to kind of counter some of these, feminism, goals, if you will, is actually going to be what some people might would call effective. Okay. And she lived into her mid to later 90s. She died just a couple years ago. So she was a pretty outspoken figure into the 80s, into the 90s, and even into the 2000s. Okay. Now, I'm not supposed to share opinions on here, and I'll try to be careful with that. But if you're kind of wondering, well, the ER being defeated, there's a little bit of progress perhaps with wages, whether you're kind of agreeing with the idea of the outcome of Roe v. Wade, what is really something that is maybe one of the more successful aspects of the feminism movement? I would argue it's Title IX. Okay. Now, Title IX, we're going to watch a video on that here in a second, but it's 37 words. Okay. But the outcome and the impact of this, as far as women in education, those of you women that are involved in athletics and other programs like that are obviously a lot more, shall we say, attended by women in the modern day, or young women. The Title IX is definitely important. Women getting scholarships to go to college in larger academic numbers, and also athletics and things like that, definitely as a result of Title IX. A lot of people are like, okay, well, what does Title IX say? Well, it's right in front of you. Okay. No person in the U.S. shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in or denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving what? Federal assistance. Okay. So basically, guys, if you're a university that's getting federal funding, or even a secondary school or middle school or elementary school, and basically, let's say, for example, in a high school, okay, let's say, I'm just using high school as an example since I teach high school, but guys, let's say that you are a high school, you get federal funding, and it's winter, sports season, winter sports season. You've got 5 males that go out for a basketball team, and let's say you have 15 females. Okay. And let's say that I'm the athletic director, and I'm like, well, we're going to have a boys team or a men's team, but you know what? We're not going to do a women's team. We don't have enough interest. Technically, one, we know that the numbers you need to play a basketball game, that's technically not true. And secondly, if we're receiving federal funding, then technically, guys, there could be an argument. There's an argument to be made that there could be a Title IX violation. Okay. And so those of you that are really interested in this, I want you to think about, how could Title IX be used as arguments in favor of violations of things like civil rights, especially in this case toward women. Okay. Now we're going to watch a quick video on Title IX. So as we watch it, pay attention to really the big outcome, and we'll talk more about that in a second.
On June 23, 1972, Richard Nixon signed Title IX into law to equalize education in the United States. We used to sit on the sidelines. We used to only be spectators. We were overlooked, undervalued. We weren't seen as profitable, as interesting, not worth the investment. Then, everything changed.
No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation. From participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance.
37 words that changed everything.
Okay, guys, hope you enjoyed that. I thought that was absolutely eye-opening, as opposed with, you know, if you did the a little bit of the notes in there. I mean, 1966, 15,000 female athletes that were participating in college athletics. That number in 2014 was over 200,000. So whether you're looking at athletics, academics, or whatever, definitely Title IX is a pretty important thing. Now, what you're going to do for your next activity is you'll notice that you have a little seminar that you're going to do. The directions for what to do are also explained more on Canvas, so please make sure you go there. But what I would like for you to do is you're going to use the primary source. There's a short excerpt from the Now Statement of Purpose in 1966. That's going to give you an idea a little bit further with some of these goals and ideas of why, you know, feminists wanted to kind of move the cause of women's rights in a certain direction, how they wanted to do it. And so there's a couple of things for you to really think about as far as goals and strategies. Okay. Now, the other side of the coin of that is, of course, going to be the role of Schlafly with, you know, wanting to protect a degree of gender, you know, tradition, et cetera, et cetera. And so I want you to think about what objections toward the feminist agenda does Schlafly emphasize. Okay, so guys, really analyze this. Think about this in terms of context, right? Why would, you know, the 1960s be a really good time for women to kind of move us forward into this newer wave, if some people call it, of feminism? You know, think about some of the things along the lines of African American civil rights, rights of other minorities, the activism of the student movement. You know, even some of the things we associate with things like consumer protection and environmental protection as far as activism. So it's a very active time, as the saying goes. And then what you're going to do is you're going to actually complete these analysis questions. Follow the guide that's on Canvas, so it'll give you specific directions. We're going to talk about this in whole class, so this will give you a little bit more to kind of think about. And as always, feel free to send me an email. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions. And I hope you enjoyed this overview of 1960s feminism. And it's certainly a topic that we'll continue to build upon throughout parts of the rest of the year. Thank you.